Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Board Engagement During a Crisis. We're proud today to have Ed Cortas, CNP's own Director of Consultant Services, to talk about how boards can help us guide and weather current challenges and position organizations for success once this storm has passed. Before we go any further, I just want to take a brief moment to review the functionality of our Zoom webinar. Right now, I have everyone on mute to avoid any background noises that may distract us from listening to the webinar. And for this presentation today, we will not be using the chat function. If you have questions as we go through the presentation, please enter them in the Q&A box. You can access that by clicking the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you see a question that is similar to yours or one that you'd like us to make sure we get to, you can tap the thumbs up icon to the left of the question, and that will move the question up to the top of the queue. Throughout the presentation, I will monitor the Q&A box, and at the end, we will answer as many questions as possible. Any questions we don't get to by the time that we end at 10:15, we will answer offline and follow up via email and post them up on our webinar file up on our Google Drive. So with that, I will now invite Ann Coffey, our CEO at CNP, to say a few words before we begin. Ann?
Thank you, Merv, and a special shout out to Ed. Thank you for stepping up to do this lead this really important conversation for us today. And I'm really excited. We got a great crowd, lots of folks on this webinar this morning, so we welcome you and delighted you're here. I want to thank those of you that have been sharing ideas with us and topics. For those of you that are participating in our Facebook group, the Nonprofit Community Connection. So if you're not on that and haven't heard of it, we encourage you to join. It's a community we're trying to nurture and to cultivate, to share ideas with each other, and also to do the self-care piece and to inspire one another and lift each other up during these times. So we've got the Facebook group going. As probably most of you know, we have an almost daily e-news with important information, and you can rest assured as soon as we hear something about the new round of funding out of Washington, we'll be on it, and we'll have tools and information for you to use to apply for those funds if you haven't. And the only thing I'll say is if you haven't applied for those funds, particularly the PPP funds, we encourage you to do it quickly. It's the first come, first served basis, and many of you may have learned in the last round that urgency is of the essence here. We did do a flash survey last week, our first one, at least our first one in a very long time, and learned a little bit about the SBA survey. We'll be doing those periodically to take your temperature, to see what's happening in your world, so you can share it back to us, and we can share it to the decision makers and others who need that information. So thank you for signing on today. Stay close, connected with us, and let us know what you need, and we're there for you. So Merv, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thank you, Ann. Today I'm happy to introduce our presenter, Ed Cortas. Ed joined the Center for Nonprofit Excellence in 2013. He comes to CNPE with over 25 years of development, operational, and management experience in the nonprofit sector, and has served on various local and regional board of directors during that time. Ed's experience has taught him that sound strategic systems of governance, management, and administration do not merely support nonprofit missions, they drive them. It is this passion in helping nonprofits evaluate, develop, and maintain those systems that he thrives on. And with that, thank you, Ed, for sharing your expertise with us today, and I'll take it away.
Thanks, Merv, and thanks for the invitation. And I guess I want to thank you all. I'm coming to you from the Upper Highlands Branch office of Center for Nonprofit Excellence. Like most of you, I'm sure I'm working from home. So anything could happen. If the dog sees the rabbit in the backyard, or if we may be treated to the view of a half-naked teenage boy, I ask you just to roll with it. And I also noticed that as the sun changes in this room, I'm fading in and out. So it's an apt sort of microcosm of what we're all experiencing right a lot of change, a lot of unpredictability, and it's reflected in so many ways in our organizations. Before I go any further, I want to say, first of all, thank you to all of you, the nonprofit who are working in the nonprofit sector. One of the things I see frequently is I've got a great job. Every day I get to be with people who have big brains and big hearts and are trying to make our community better. And I've not seen that any more heroically than I have in the last 4 weeks in watching this sector and your individual organizations hold all of that together. So a big thank you, just as a citizen of this community. And of course, we know that that wouldn't be possible if we didn't have effective boards that are governing those organizations. And so those of you who are on boards, those of you who are board chairs, another big thank you to all of you. We know that you're not getting paid for this work when you're on a board. You've got your own issues surrounding COVID-19, personally and professionally, and yet you are taking the time to step up and govern in very difficult times for the nonprofit. So many thanks to you all as well for the incredible work that you're doing. So what are we going to cover today? The theme is, what is in a crisis situation, and I would say specifically in this crisis situation, what does a board do? Where should the priorities be? What should the board be thinking about? How should it be acting? How should it be interacting with the executive staff? That's really what we're going to be covering today. But before we go there, I'd like to share with you. So we're going to talk a little. We're going to talk about that. We're going to do the Q&A, and then have some final thoughts. So you all have seen this before. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Carr is attributed, that quote is attributed to Carr. Typically we say it in sort of a sarcastic way, right? He was a critic, a journalist, and a novelist in France. He may have meant it this way, but we tend to think of it as, oh, here we go again. Things are changing, but some things just never change. We say it about politics. We say it about family dynamics. We say it about people we know, right? I would like to think about this in terms of boards in these times in just a little bit of a different way. The literal translation from the French is, the more it changes, the more it is the same thing. And I think that's how we need to think about boards, right? It would be easy to go through a laundry list of things boards should be doing in a reactionary mode. But there is a larger context to this that hasn't changed, that is still critical for boards. The duties of the board during critical times like these don't change, right? You still have to have, the board still has a duty of care. It still has to pay attention to organization and make good decisions. The duty of loyalty is still important, that when you're sitting in the boardroom, your attention is fully on the health of that organization and its mission. That's more critical now than ever. And the duty of obedience is still important. It's easy in these times to kind of get scatterbrained about things, and we forget our mission. The duty of obedience reminds board members to continue to look at the mission, to continue hold that up and follow that, and make sure that that is the touchstone for all in the larger context for everything that's going. Those things don't change. The modes of operation of the board, they don't change either. Certainly in these times, there's a huge fiduciary responsibility, right? You have to, you as a board of directors, you are entrusted with the resources of the community, that and to see that those resources are used in the execution of the mission. And everything around paying attention to financials, paying attention to programming, none of that changes in a crisis. It's even heightened. The community is depending on you as a board even more to make sure these things are happening. Strategic mode is still important. Obviously, if maybe not the long-term arc that we were thinking about, so much has changed, but maybe in the short term, it's still important to think about strategy, and we'll talk much more about that. And finally, the generative. When when there's so much going on, it is really hard, I think, when I say going on, I mean up close and right in our faces with critical decisions that have to be made, with things changing so quickly, when so much is in our face. It's really hard to lift our gaze a little bit and think creatively. And maybe our staffs, our organizational staff, our ED, our CEO, may not be in that mode, but certainly there's space on the board to be in that generative mode. And we'll talk more about that too. All this just to say is that there is a context for how the board goes forward, and that hasn't changed. We still have to pay attention to our duties. We still have to act in these different modes of operation. All right, within those things though, what do these duties, these modes look like in these challenging times? And so the context I'm going to present this in is kind of the old things come in sevens, right? Well, this is 7 things every board must do. But what we're going to do is look at those 7 things and say, okay, but in a time of crisis, and specifically in this time of crisis, in this time of really unprecedented challenge, what does the board focus on within these 7 aspects? So certainly the board is always managing itself, renewing itself. It's paying attention to staffing, particularly the ED and the CEO. The board plans, it monitors progress at a strategic level typically. It is concerned with providing resources, read fundraising for the organization, certainly is involved in maintaining the integrity of the organization and doing that long-term visioning piece. Those are all in good times and in bad. Those are the roles and responsibilities of the board. What we'll do today is take those and then say, okay, but in this situation, what needs to be emphasized? All right. Let's take managing and renewing. You know, in good times and in bad, boards should be having productive, well-attended meetings, paying attention to those meetings, coming to those meetings prepared and ready to make good decisions. The board should have around it an effective committee structure and to actually do the work of the board, and the board should take some time to regenerate. Typically, that's what we mean by managing and renewing, right? What does that mean in times like now? Well, first of all, I think committees and task forces are really helpful, are really critical in these times, right? The board should spend some time thinking about what are the critical committees that we need to pour our efforts into right now. Certainly, the finance committee is probably more important than it's ever been before, because so many of us are facing critical financial challenges. So making sure that that committee is up and functioning, and that if we don't have the right people on it, that we perhaps pull people from outside the organization to sit on that committee. Maybe another one is the development committee as we face fundraising challenges. The fundraising committee, not only in making sure that the organization has a development plan, a fundraising plan for these times, but also the real strength of the development committee is the same as always, helping the board fulfill its own fundraising responsibilities, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But in these times, you know, as we think about task forces and committees, it really is what the old saw, form follows function. What structures do we have to have in place to help us navigate these times? There could be the typical committees. A lot of organizations are putting together what they're calling a COVID-19 task force, right? Which is a collection, maybe it's their executive committee, but sometimes it's just a collection of experts that they know, maybe one from human resources, one from legal, some finance, pulling those folks together as a task force to focus specifically on how are we managing these times, to be a resource for the executive director, to be a resource to the board as it plans in the future. And their focus, though, is really how keeping a watchful eye on what's going on in the community, in their areas, and bringing that to the organization. So if you don't have something like that, if your executive committee isn't functioning that way, it might be important to consider just a core collection of folks that could focus on that. Of course, meetings are different now, aren't they? Right? Where we may have been meeting face to face, now it's conference call, or it's Zoom, or it's a combination of those things. Some things, however, don't change. And first of all, this is not the time to disregard the bylaws. You'll be making a lot of critical decisions. You'll be trying to figure out a lot of things, and the bylaws are your rules of the road. So first of all, if you don't know what's in them, now's a great time to crack them open. Take a look at them and read them, and understand how your organization and the board is going to make decisions in these times. It's not enough just to know what they are. We need to follow them as well. And it is easy, again, in a time of crisis when it's crazy, to kind of throw those things out the window, right? Not following the bylaws is never a problem until there's a problem. If there's a breach in procedure and folks take issue with the decision that was made, they can always come back to the procedural point legitimately with concerns about how decisions were made. So know what your bylaws are and continue to follow them. Don't set them aside right now. Particularly about virtual meetings, in a regular board meeting, it's easy. Even if we're sitting around a table, you have quiet people. It's easy for people not to be engaged. It is so much easier in a virtual meeting to go in that direction. So make sure people are engaged in your virtual meetings. Make sure that everyone has an opportunity to speak. And when they are speaking, that they introduce themselves if you can't see them, so you know who's speaking, you know who's attending. You're going to have to pay a lot of extra attention to things we never had to before in terms of engagement, participation, and when it comes to things like voting, making sure that we know who is saying what. Record keeping, similarly. At the very least, if your board isn't great at minutes, at the very least, be recording actions and decisions and when they were made and making those clear. If you're recording your conversations or either video or audio, I would suggest using those recordings only to construct minutes, not to make them actually part of the record. There's so much discussion that goes on at a board meeting that having a literal record like that is not that helpful. Then, of course, pay attention to voting, right? A lot of the idea around the virtual meeting is that everyone has the opportunity to weigh in and to vote. There are other options for voting. If you can vote by email, you can vote by mail, but it has to be unanimous consent. If it's not unanimous consent, then you have to find a way to bring people together to actually hold a vote in a way that everyone can hear one another and have a concurrent conversation. So those are the critical pieces about meetings and engagement. So on most boards, you don't always, I would say, the boards I've worked with, not everyone always gets along with one another. Sometimes there's contentious arguments. There is good conflict. Sometimes it's not so productive. When the stress is on, those kinds of behaviors get magnified quite a bit. So you may have to pay more attention in your board meetings to how we're treating one another, how we're talking to one another, and hold each other accountable for our behavior in the board meeting so that they're productive and respectful, and that the focus of the meetings are on the work that needs to be done, not on individual personalities. It's a tall order, and it's hard to do even in non-crisis times. It's really critical in times like these. Staffing. So typically we would say the board really only has one staff person that it's worried about. It's the ED and the CEO. That person is charged with building out the staff in its entirety. So you're probably Hopefully you're not in the process now of trying to, hire an ED or CEO. This would be a tough time to do it, but if you have to, I suppose that's where you're at. But really in this area, it's more about supporting the ED and the CEO. That's where the real emphasis needs to be. So the ED CEO relationship with the board chair is really critical right now. Maintaining that relationship and even building it if it needs some work is important. The board chair, if you're a board chair out there, you really need to make yourself available to the ED and the CEO as a sounding board, as a partner in this work. They're on the ground trying to do a lot of things. And as all of us who have held positions like this know, it truly is lonely at the top. There are not a lot of places you can go. The board chair is an excellent place where a CEO, ED can go when they've got questions, when they need guidance, when they're trying to understand what the board is talking about, when they're trying to understand the direction of the board. So maintaining that relationship and enhancing it is a critical part right now. And as a board chair, you need to take the lead on that and make sure that you're available to work with the leader of your organization. Obviously, the ED CEO relationship to the board is really important as well, to the board as a whole, right? And as a board, you all can really be a sounding board as well. But obviously, there's a lot around helping the executive director brainstorm and problem solve, wrapping more than one head around some issues or problems, and helping to provide guidance and direction. Now more than ever, in sort of a focused way. I know for our own organization, when it became obvious that we at CMPE were going to have to pivot to be able to support the organization, the nonprofit sector in a very different way. Our board got together and they just kind of threw out the agenda and said, let's just brainstorm. What does CNPE need to be right now for the nonprofit community? Just had a great brainstorm that gave direction to our CEO, who could then give direction to us as staff about where to go. So supporting the executive director and thereby supporting the staff as a board is really critical right now. Balance is really critical right now as well. So we talk a lot about the board not getting in the weeds, the board not getting involved in operations. In these times, there may be a need for more of that. It really depends on your organization. But jumping in and trying to run the organization is not where the board needs to be right now. You're going to create more problems that way. In the short term, also in the long term, you may be creating habits about how the board operates that will live on beyond this current crisis. So knowing when to jump in and taking this ED or CEO's lead on that is really critical. The board chair needs to be needs to help the board discern that with the help of the CEO about when it needs to weigh in and when it needs to back off. Sometimes too much help is actually a problem. So to pay attention to that. Wrapped around all of that is communication. Good communication between the ED and the CEO. The ED, CEO, and the board chair. Maybe the board chair just needs to be available on call for the ED. Certainly, a once a week conversation about how things are going. The communication between the ED and the board itself, maybe that looks like a weekly email that's just updating the board on just where the organization is at, where it's facing challenges. Certainly the board chair can communicate to the board itself, how does the board understand where it's going? And then the chair can communicate that to the ED and the CEO. If you think you're communicating enough, communicate just a little bit more. It's really critical, obviously, in these times to make sure everybody is on the same page. Planning. So maybe your strategic plan your strategic plan doesn't feel as relevant right now. And that's really the plan of the board, right? I mean, the board adopts the strategic plan. The board monitors progress at the strategic level. Maybe those ideas you put into your strategic plan a year ago or a few months ago or even 2 years ago don't make any sense right now. Relying on a strategic plan right now probably doesn't make sense. But even if we can't use our plan, it doesn't mean that the board is not thinking strategically. So the board can be really helpful in developing a short-term and a long-term plan. Maybe a short-term plan looks more like a 30, 60, 90 kind of plan. Here's what we're going to do in the short term. You know, the first 30 days, we're assessing, we're trying to understand. We're trying to understand what's going on. We're setting some goals. We're playing out some scenarios, or we're setting up some scenarios. Maybe in the 60 days, we're testing those things. And adjusting along the way. Maybe in the 90 days, we're thinking more long-term. However it works out for your organization, the board should not jettison strategic thinking, but in the place of the plan itself, be developing maybe a shorter term thinking with shorter term planning with sort of a strategic vision to it. The board can also be really helpful when it comes to scenarios and contingencies. Every organization should be working through a set of scenarios right now, from worst case to more likely cases. And the board can be very helpful with that because you come from a lot of different, you have a passion, you understand what the organization is doing, but you come from a lot of different places, a lot of different perspectives. So this is where the board can really be helpful in generating input into a scenario planning process and giving feedback on those scenarios. And when we say worst case scenario, the board should take worst case seriously. Optimism bias is a real thing. We hope for good outcomes. Our disposition might be to think positively. We don't necessarily want to look at the hard facts, the possible negative outcomes, but we need to. We need to construct a worst case scenario. If we don't raise another dime from this day forward, what does that look like? If we lose this much staff, either to sickness or because we have to lay off, what does that look like? What is the plan around that? And have in place other more likely plans. But again, the board can be critical in laying these out and then helping the ED or the CEO assess and adjust going forward. It may be really, really hard to think long-term right now. And this is what the board does, right? The board is supposed to be thinking long-term. It might be hard to do that right now. We're head down trying to figure out very, very short-term, critical, house on fire sorts of things, right? So it's hard to think long-term. And maybe there's not the capacity to do that. But what the board can be doing is taking a step back and observing how the organization is reacting, observing what's going on in our communities, observing how the people we serve are affected by this, how the people we serve are being changed in these times, right? And start collecting data and thinking about that, right? And thinking, what is emerging out of this? Can we begin to see, if not the path forward, at least what that landscape is looking like? Those are very strategic, those are very generative sorts of activities, conversations that the board can have at this time. And then finally, I would say, as we go along in our planning at whatever level, let's just admit to one another right here and now, we're not going to get it right? So much has changed. Think about where we were 4 weeks ago compared to where we are now. The world literally is absolutely different. Our communities are different. Our organizations are different. Any plan we lay out right now, let's just say, it's probably going to be wrong. It's probably not, we're not going to see everything. That doesn't mean we don't do it. Like all plans, two things are really important. One, whatever plan we do come up with gives us the opportunity to, right there in black and white, to make intentional decisions about how going forward, how we go forward when it's not working out the way we thought. So our decisions are intentional. They're not reactionary. We thought we were going to do this, but now we're going to do that. The other part of the plan is not even really the plan itself. It's the discipline of planning, because the discipline of planning makes us take into account external factors, internal factors, forces us to have a good sense of what the landscape is, to assess our own strengths and weaknesses on the inside, to how we can leverage the strengths, how we can mitigate the weaknesses. A good planning process, a good sort of regular strategic thinking leverages all of those important disciplines. So planning may seem difficult even in the short term right now, but it's still critical, and it's still an important part of what the board needs to do. The board typically monitors progress, right? And usually that's tied to the strategic plan. You have a set of outcomes that you're striving for in a long-term plan, and you've got metrics set up that are measuring those things. Ideally, and whatever plan you're operating with now, if it's a 30, 60, 90, or if it's just a short-term operational plan, whatever it is, obviously part of what the board needs to do is first understand that plan and then monitor how the organization is progressing to do that. So, whatever goals and objectives are being set up right now, the board should be paying attention to those and looking to support the executive director, CEO, and the staff in achieving those. But certainly, if you don't have one right now, here's a great time just to develop a simple dashboard for the board to look at whenever it meets or whenever it seems feasible to gather the data, right? And so you think of a car dashboard, right? What's the critical pieces of that? You don't have 20 things on a car dashboard. In today's cars, you could have 100 things on that dashboard, right? Tracking all sorts of stuff. But there's only like a handful, 5 things that we really need to pay attention to. We need to know how fast we're going. We need to know how much gas we have. We need to know if the engine's overheating. We need to know if we happen to be driving a manual. We need to know what the RPMs are. We need to know maybe a trip meter. We need to know what gear we're in. What are the handful of things that as a board you need to know in these times to make sure that the organization is functioning the best it can, to keep your finger on the pulse of the organization? What are the 5, 6, 7 measurements you're going to pay attention to as a board every time you meet, right? There's going to be some financial ones. How many days of cash do we have left? Maybe a cash flow analysis. Maybe it's weekly, maybe it's monthly for the next few weeks or months. Something around programming. Maybe tracking program participation now versus a year ago to get a sense of where your services are changing. Something around staff morale. These are tough times, and so maybe it's part of the ED or CEO's job to just poll the staff on the weekly Zoom call or whatever, or via email. How you doing personally? How you doing professionally? And get a sense of that the ED can report back to the board. Whatever it is, what are those handful of things you're going to pay attention to keep you in the game, keep you engaged, and to see where the organization is going. If you already have a dashboard, that's great. Continue to use it, but you might find that it's not measuring the important things right now, and be okay to change it. The idea is that the board has in front of it the information it needs to manage these difficult times, to govern. I'm sorry, not manage, to govern in these difficult times. So, like the plan itself, don't be wedded to your dashboard. If you need to be putting other things in front of the board, do that, but create one. A dashboard's good to have even when you're not in a crisis. So here's an opportunity actually to do something in the short term to build into how your board culture and the way you function that could have a lot of benefits when we come out the other end of this as well. Dashboards are one of those things. Fundraising, providing resources, fundraising, right? Not a lot changes with this, right? Every board needs to be involved in fundraising. It's a best practice. Typically the board has set up for the board different ways board members can participate, a menu of ways of participating, everything from making the ask to making thank you calls. It's a time to look at that menu and see what are the critical pieces of that right now that need to happen, and encourage board members to get to take part in that. It's a time to refresh, it's time to re-energize that menu, time to get people involved again in it if it's been lacking a little bit. If not now, then whenever. Then when's a better time, right? That doesn't go away, but you may emphasize different things and ask the board to step up in different ways. And as board members, we should be doing that. Now is a good time, though, to have board members recanvass their networks and connections, though. Who do we know who's passionate about what we do? And it could help us with resources right now. To have that, if you haven't had it recently, to have that conversation right now. Another great board brainstorm. Who do we know? Who do we know is involved? Who do we know that was involved that isn't anymore, that still wants us, that's still interested in, that could still be interested in supporting our work? And sort of refresh that list. And then, of course, to the extent possible, the individual board members can support the organization. That's critical as well. So in the area of fundraising, while our fundraising tactics and stuff may be very different right now, and we're going to have a webinar in 2 days about fundraising in crisis mode, and it's all over the web. We've got resources on our website, in our resource list about this. There's a lot to be done. But the board's responsibilities really need, as board members, we really need to step up in this space. Maintaining the integrity of the organization. This is critical in good times when we're not faced with crisis. It's indispensable when we're under so much pressure, right? There are some very different things we're dealing with now than we have before. Typically the board is charged with fiscal oversight, making sure we're compliant with various legal standards and ethical norms. The board is always responsible for that. But there are so many decisions we're making now, particularly in the areas of human resources and finance, that require a heightened attention to compliance. Human resources do we understand, does the board understand what the employee handbook is saying? And if you don't have an employee handbook, do we know what the law is? And if we don't know what the law is, where is a resource? Do we know someone that we can bring into our conversations to help us understand things around sick leave, paid leaves of absence, furloughs, layoffs? There's a lot we're in uncharted waters for a lot of us right now. And the board needs to make sure we're compliant in all of those areas. And if we aren't, how to get it straight. And if we don't have the knowledge, where to go and find it. That is the board's responsibility to make sure that that's happening. Same with the financial stuff as well. If you were lucky enough to get a PPP loan, or if you got an EIDL loan, there are ways we have to comply with the terms of those loans. The board should understand what those are, at least generally, and make sure that we are compliant with those. Again, in uncharted territory, we need to make sure folks that the board is being compliant in those areas. So there's that around maintaining integrity, and then there's a whole other area around organizational values, where our integrity as organizations are really rooted. Now is the time to take that plaque off the wall that has our values on it. They're in either if it's in our office or if it's in the waiting room or wherever, that says, we are this, we believe this. It's time to actually take those off the wall and put them in front of us. And use them as templates, as rubrics for how we're going to do business. Just as times like these can bring out the best and the worst in individuals. It will certainly press out the best and the worst of us as organizations. Where do we fall back to? Where is the base that we're going to operate from? That base at the very base is our values, our organizational values. We're making tough decisions right now, tough decisions about programming, tough decisions about staff. How are we not only how we approach these conversations, how we make these decisions, the criteria by which we make these decisions have to be rooted in our organizational values. We may disagree as members of a board. We may disagree with the direction. We may have disagreements about priorities and the like. What we should not be disagreeing about is our organizational values. And so how we treat each other, how our decisions reflect those values should be something we all agree on. And now is the time to really use these things. We say all the time, the values just aren't these pie in the sky sorts of statements. They are real, and they should dictate how we behave. We should give up the whole mission before we give up our values. We have to remember that. And our integrity, the integrity of the organization really will remain intact to the degree we pay attention to those values. Then finally, envisioning the future. This is probably the hardest thing to think about right now, right? Again, we're so head down, we're so focused on critical things right in front of us. How can we think about the future? At some point, however, we're going to come out on the other side of this, and we have no idea really what that looks like. Maybe a glimmer, but that at the most, right? So right now, how do we just pay attention, think about observe what we're doing, collect data, and at some point, the board is going to have to ask itself, so what does it all mean? What does all of this mean? Everything we've experienced and observed. And how are we going to go forward with this new information? So, typically organizations have sort of a community vision, right? Our vision statements are about, no child goes to bed hungry, right? Every pet has a home, whatever it is. How is our vision for the community changing as a result of this? What are the new realities those we serve? What are they facing now? And if our vision is changing, then how does that affect our mission? How will we have to live our mission out differently going forward? Because the needs of our community are different. And then finally, what does that mean for us as, the vision, small v, our organizational vision? What does that mean for us? Who are we becoming right now? And what does that mean for our future? It may be hard to think about that longer arc, but it needs to begin with the board. And it needs to, right now, at least in terms of paying attention to what's going on. All right. So that's how, we would say that's how boards, where boards should be placing their emphasis in these times, in these different areas, while still exercising their duties, while still participating in those modes of operation. I just have one additional thought before we go to Q&A. And I think, I guess what I'd like to say is, it's probably in times like these, we need to pay attention to our humanity more than anything else. All of us, this has affected us in a very, very personal way, right? We're talking about our personal health. We're talking about our relationships. It's a very, very human human challenge that we face right now. And it has very, very personal impacts, right? You know, we're staying healthy at home. Our social circles have been pared all the way back in so many ways. We have some of us who never wanted to homeschool are homeschooling now, right? We're trying to learn how to work from home, how to be effective when we were worried about our jobs. We're worried about our organizations. Maybe we have elderly parents that we're concerned about. Maybe our kids are far flung and we don't know how, we're worried about them. This is affecting us in a very, very personal way. As a result, we have to remember that our capacity to live up to our responsibilities is different. It's diminished, it's mitigated, it's compromised. And on top of that, it's changing all the time, right? Yes, these times it has become more apparent than ever that the common good of our communities, the human services, the things that the safety in our community are reliant on the nonprofit sector. If this time shows us nothing else, it's that, right? And so much of how we can react as a sector collectively and as individual organizations does depend on good governance. And so much of good governance does in fact depend on board members stepping up to fill roles and responsibilities of the board, to be heroic in those ways, right? But we have to remember that we are human, that these are unparalleled times, that we will struggle to meet these important, take on these important responsibilities. So I suggest that in addition to holding ourselves accountable to these things, we also give each other a lot of grace on our boards, with our staff, with each other in the community. I think when we look back on these times, we're going to see heroes everywhere, heroic organizations, heroic individuals. We will be amazed at how people stepped up and what we accomplished. I'd like to think, though, that we'll also look back and we'll see that those heroics were made possible because we cared about each other. We recognized our humanity in this, and we loved each other through it. If you boards can do nothing more than that, I'd say that's critical. All right, that's all I got. I'm sorry, I went a little bit over time, and there was a lot to say. I'm gonna turn a little bit so I don't look like I'm being interviewed as a ex-mob member here. Get a little bit of sun. Merv, do we have any questions?
Yeah, thank you very much. That was really, really great. We do have a couple questions to come in, so folks, if you have any additional questions for Ed, please type them in again in our Q&A box, and be more than happy to address them in our remaining time. So Ed, our first question this morning is, do you have any other areas to suggest for a current dashboard?
Besides the financial stuff?
Yeah.
Well, the financial stuff, I think I said the financial stuff, which again, I would kind of look at some of the immediate stuff like cash flow, and you could do maybe a budget analysis and the like, right? How are we doing compared to where we thought we'd be as a budget? But for many of us, our budgets are kind of out the window anyway. Something around programming, I think I mentioned that as well, and morale. After that, I think those are the critical pieces. After that, I think the question really go back to your board and say, what do you need to know? What do you want to know? What would help you make the best decisions? And have a good brainstorm around that. You'll come up, if you're lucky, you'll come up with 50 ideas, and do not create a dashboard around that. But really prioritize what are the 5, 6, 7 things we need to be looking at. For some of us, it might be external things as well. Are there things we need to be tracking out there? But beyond the financial, the human resources, and the programmatic stuff, it really is, what does your board need to know?
That's a great question. All right, we have our next question, Ed, is tied around motivation and engagement here. How do you get board members motivated at this time, especially when they're not in the day-to-day operations? Is it the CEO's, ED's job to motivate them? And what would you recommend in terms of board to continue board engagement during this time? Should we have additional virtual meetings? Should we have more phone calls? What's your recommendation on that?
Yeah. So, gosh, if your board isn't engaged in these times, right? I think to understand engagement is to understand what do they need? What do they need to remain engaged? So there's some sort of practical procedural things you can do, like to set up a regular check-in. Maybe you have just sort of a regular organizational check-in. The ED or CEO is going to be available for an hour on this day every week. Board members can call in, check in with them with any questions that they might have. Certainly, I think coming up with a regular meeting period for the board, whether you have quorum or not, just to check in at regular time is important. I think giving them things to be engaged about or engaged in is important. Like, we talked about this, brainstorm around, I really need your input around dashboard. What do you all need to know? Let's have a brainstorming session around that. Get their feedback about that. What are the organizational priorities right now? Yeah, as an ED or a CEO, I am charged with executing those, but I need direction. I need help, and that is a governance thing. Can we have a 1-hour brainstorming session about where we should put our programmatic emphases right now, and let the ED take that back, craft a plan or craft a series of priorities, and then bring that back to the board for discussion. Give them specific ways to plug in addition to the normal ways of meetings and making decisions. I mean, certainly, if we're lucky enough to be able to apply for another round of loans, there's going to be decisions that have to be made around that. But again, the key is, how do you give folks things that allow them to get engaged around the fundraising stuff? Is another thing. How do we fundraise in these times? How can the board help? Let's do a brainstorm around that. We'll come up with a plan. Let's bring that back to the board. The board chair, it's hard for an ED to leverage a lot of that because the power relationship is all wrong. And those of us who've been executive directors know, we can say the board needs to do this. You all need to be doing this. You need to be doing that. And the board may or may not react. It's a different thing when the board chair or the executive committee comes forward and says, we really need to be engaged around this. If it's a series of phone calls or whatever, but we need to step up. It's a different power dynamic. So I would enlist the help of the board chair, the executive committee, other leaders on the board to say, to draw other board members in. The development committee on the board, for instance, maybe they don't spend as much time thinking about fundraising out there, but they spend their time engaging fellow board members on what they need to be doing to help raise funds, for an example. But board leadership that isn't the CEO and ED is really critical in this engagement piece as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question. Any suggestions on how to strategize for the future given so many unknowns and not being able to do so in person? Usually in the past it's taken a lot of time, and now we've got Zoom. What are your thoughts about doing surveys and what in order to help folks strategize for the future?
Yeah, so I think it's that whole question about what's the place of long-term thinking in such a short-term challenging environment, right? And so I would say it may be really, really hard to think beyond next steps. I know as an organization at CNPE, we already see the need to turn that corner, not just for our organization, but for the sector itself. But it's still really hard. So I would say, make sure you're attending to the short term well, and that you can have that in hand as well as possible, and help the board to understand that, so that the board has some headspace to think about, okay, so what does come next? In the meantime, we're gathering data, right? We're observing the people we serve. We're observing what's going on in the broader community. And at some point, when there's time to bring what we're learning back, and have a discussion with the board about that. And the first discussions should probably be a little bit low key about the long-term stuff, right? What are we thinking? What are we seeing? What's the general trends we're seeing? And preparing ourselves for more specific conversations that are going to come later, specifically about, okay, what about our strategic plan? Or what does the long-term look like right now? So what can we do in this data gathering and observing phase? We can do things around surveys, surveying the people we, maybe surveying our donors, surveying the people that we work with, gathering data from them. I wonder if there isn't a little bit of survey fatigue going on. It seems like everybody's asking everybody about how they're feeling or doing or whatever around all of this. I think, so there may be formal things like the survey, but also I think staying in touch with staff who are on the front line and can tell you what's going on, and gathering that data, and really focusing on just gathering data and starting to think about, and what are we learning? Informing that base for the longer term. Take the pressure off of yourselves right now, I would say, as board members, of figuring out the future. I've got 2 college kids. I don't even know if there's going to be a fall semester, right? There's so much we don't know. Take the pressure off from trying to figure that out, and put all of that energy into just observing, seeing what's emerging, and when it feels like we've got the space to ask those questions, what's next?
Thank you, Ed. You mentioned earlier about the development committee. I'm wondering what role do you see the committees are at this time? I mean, what should they continue to meet? What's their role? Should they play?
Committees in general?
Yes.
Committees in general. Well, again, it's sort of form follows function, right? So committees, the definition of the committee, they do the hands-on work of the board, right? So what hands-on work does the board need to be focused on right now? So probably something around financial planning. So, that committee should be functioning. And if you don't have all the expertise on it that you need, then canvas board members and who can bring help into that committee, even in the short term. So certainly that, I would say the development committee, like we talked about, like I mentioned there. But, the question after that is, what other committees do we need? What are we trying to do right now? So, if we have do we have a real need for assessing our programming right now? Maybe the programming committee then needs to be meeting more frequently. Maybe we need to make a programming committee where we didn't need one before to address these questions. I would let the priorities of the organization drive what committees are really active. And if a committee, if your gala is canceled, then the gala committee probably doesn't need to meet, as an example. The other thing I consider is a COVID-19 committee. Do you have a kind of the blue ribbon panel, whether it's your executive committee or people with specific expertise formed around looking specifically at how the organization needs to react to the current realities in different ways, human resources, legal, and the like. I think a task force or committee around that could be really, really helpful right now and help inform the rest of the committees and the rest of the board members how to go forward. But structure is great, but it's not great when it doesn't serve the larger purpose. So let your priorities drive how you form committees and task forces. You'll learn a lot. We're going to learn a lot about this. We're going to learn that committee we thought was so critical, really, just now we know why it never met. It just isn't important. But, a task force that always looks at this is stuff like that.
Great, thank you, Ed. Any other questions out there? Please feel free to add them in the Q&A. We have time for a few more, but please feel free to continue to ask your questions if you have any in the Q&A box. Ed, while we're waiting for more questions, what were your thoughts around board recruitment at this time? Should the board, if the board was thinking about recruiting and adding members and filling needs, should they continue to do that, or how should they proceed with regards to boards and board recruitment?
Yeah, so I think the way to think about that is to look. One of the many things these times will press out is our bench. How deep is our bench in different areas? And where we may have suspected we didn't have expertise or needed expertise, or were under expertised, that's going to become really, really apparent right now. I would say maybe the emphasis isn't so much on how do we get fill boards, expired terms, or fill or build up our board. I would say maybe it's not that as much as, gosh, who do we need involved in this mission, right? Who can maybe there are folks that we can approach to come on our board because we need this expertise right now. Maybe that's it. Certainly we can use our committees to draw other people in, but I would say, rather than the formality of building a board, just say, who do we need gathered around this mission? And that we can rely on as resources, as our, our lifeline, draw them into committees. And put our emphasis around that and the work. And then I think, when we come out on the other end of these people then could become great candidates. Some of these will be great candidates to bring on our board. We'll have worked with them. They'll have worked with us. They may have realized a passion. There may be some opportunity to, quote unquote, fill the board. But I think we just have to be really practical in these times and say, maybe our board is short right now, but how do we gather people around this at work? Who do we know? And how do we invite them in?
Great. Thank you, Ed. All right. Any final thoughts before we break there? Anyone?
Well, I don't know if Ann Coffey is still within the sound of my voice, but I would love to put her on the spot right now and just say, from a CEO's perspective, is there anything she can tell other CEOs out there?
At the same time of the survey, only 23% had received funding. So it felt.
Oh, I think she's on another call.
I think she's on another call. Yeah, I believe she had at 10 o'clock. But so let's see. Actually, I think something else came in. All right. So thank you, everyone. Ed, did you want to say maybe a couple words about the free consulting that we're offering right now for folks?
Yeah. So we have CNPE has a team of 4 consultants. They're well-seasoned nonprofit folks. They've been in the sector for years, have run organizations, have consulted with organizations a long time. As you can imagine right now, we have a lot of bandwidth for helping organizations. A lot of you know, if you're in the middle of the strategic planning process, you're probably not doing anything along that right now. So these folks have stepped up and say, we would love to share our expertise with organizations that just need some assistance, particularly leadership, board chairs, CEOs, EDs, and they're willing to help think through a lot of things we're talking about right now. What does short-term, long-term planning look like right now? How do I handle staff morale? How do I show up as a leader in these times? Maybe we can't answer questions around very specific sorts of HR stuff, but this group of folks could be a great sounding board, help you generate some ideas around leadership and planning and strategy and staff management morale, and are willing to share their time. So if you're on our newsletter, there's a link on the most recent newsletter that'll bring you to a page where you can just sign up, and we'll get you to a consultant for, we say an hour, but I don't think anybody's really running the meter on that. And a lot of them have said, if an hour is not enough, we're happy to meet with them at other times as well. I would take advantage of that, if nothing else, than just to have another sounding board. And Merv, I think can you send out the link to that sign up sheet when you send out the follow up to this?
Yes, absolutely. I can do that. And we'll send out copies of the PDF of the presentation, as well as a link to this recorded webinar. So Ed, thank you again today for your presentation. And for those of you
it's my pleasure
here, thank you for attending this morning. As I mentioned, we will send out a copy of the slide deck and the link to the recording, which you then can review and share for those who weren't able to attend today. Once this webinar ends, a link to a feedback survey will appear. So if you could, please take a couple minutes to fill that out. We'd greatly appreciate it. And then finally, we have a couple more webinars coming up. On Thursday at 2 p.m., we'll have Bill Stanikevich from the Lilly School of Philanthropy on to talk about fundraising in the midst of pandemic. And next Tuesday, April 28th, we will have Tucker Oldham from the Advanced Business Solutions on to talk about remote working tools. So if you had questions about and want to know more information about the difference between Zoom or Microsoft Teams or even Google Hangouts, then join us next Tuesday for more information about that. As always, we will share registration information via email in our e-news. If you haven't signed up, please do so. Again, we reference our resource list, so check that out because that gets updated daily. And then please ask a question or join our nonprofit community Facebook group where people can share and connect virtually. All that information can be found on our website at cep.org. At this point, thank you again for joining us, and we will see you again next time. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.